various opinions about various people. Various opinions about various people. Some say, or at least they said, Tiger Woods, greatest athlete that the golf world has ever known. Others, different opinion. They're so put out with his moral choices that they don't care if they ever see him in another tournament. And the latest, well, he's talking with the Saudis regarding a merger between the PGA and the LIV, those two tournaments that are taking place miles apart, countries apart. Plus, he is also looking at a whole new tournament called TGA. And this one article that I read that's very recent about him, he had this phrase, leaving golf fans enraged. Well, various opinions about various people, huh? Good old FDR, 32nd president of the United States. Some would say, greatest president ever to hold that prestigious office. Others, totally opposite. Others say, oh, I think he was one of the worst. I think his policies were almost socialistic, next door to communism. Wide range of opinions. Same person. Elvis. Remember what Mom and Dad used to say about Elvis? I mean, there are some, of course, that call him the king and he reigns supreme in their music world, but there were others that were put off by his offbeat style of that day. And they said, why, he's unfit for human consumption and belongs in a cage. Various opinions. I'm not even going to get into the arena of the politicians. Oh boy. Talk about opinions about various people. And it's the same people that we end up in big discussions, sometimes arguments with over them and our opinion about them. So we're in the series on the book of Mark. We're looking at each chapter, though we're not looking at every verse in each chapter. We're picking a passage in each chapter. And how many chapters are there? Anybody remember? 16. 16 chapters. You say, well, that's 16 Sundays. No, I don't want to preach that long. I gotta kind of cut it in two usually, often anyway, as you well know. But this week we do enter into the third chapter. Now let's just set a little background here. This is still early in the ministry, the 3-year ministry of Jesus, and this first year is very, very public, where he's really working with the crowds, and he's very busy. Many healings in this first year. The commentators like to call it the popular year, the first year, the popular year, when the crowds are big and they're pressing on him. But already, and we see it, for instance, in today's passage, we will see that the Pharisees and the religious leaders are beginning to show opposition. And even though he's up in Galilee, they're coming from all the way down in Judea, little bands, little scouting bands of Pharisees and religious leaders who do not feel comfortable with Jesus. And it's going to get greater and greater until finally they begin to show open opposition. Now, where we are today is down at the end of chapter 3. So Jesus is in Capernaum. This is just before he calls the 12. You'll see that if you look back in chapter 3, if you have your Bibles open. And if you're looking at the other Gospels and trying to put the different events of his ministry together, a couple things that Mark doesn't have that the other Gospels will show is the Sermon on the Mount, for instance. Now, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew tells us about, Luke tells us about, Mark doesn't, but it would have happened right before this passage that we're looking at today in the Capernaum area in Upper Galilee. So, as we look at this text, think back to that little truth that I gave you at the beginning. There are always varied opinions, and in this case, about Jesus. There are always varied opinions about Jesus. We're just going to look at the first couple of verses here in our passage, which begins with verse 20. Okay, chapter 3, verse 20. Then Jesus entered a house, very possibly the same house that he's been in the other passages that we looked at. Very possibly this is Peter's house again. And again, a crowd gathered. Well, this is the popular time of Jesus' ministry. This is when big crowds come. So that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. 21. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him. Isn't that interesting? Let's go take charge of the Son of God. Right. They went to take charge of him, for they said, he's out of his mind. Can you imagine saying that to God? God, you're out of your mind. Now, you might think that or feel that sometimes. You probably wouldn't say it. Some say, this is an opinion about Jesus. Some say he's crazy. He's nuts. He's not playing with a full deck. He's lost it. Why? What was it specifically about Jesus that caused his opponents to say he's crazy? Or sometimes not even his opponents. I mean, I don't think his family, some of them were somewhat opposed to him, but weren't totally opposed to him. And yet they're saying it also. Well, I think it's this. It's his lack of concern. Hang on here with me for a minute, okay? We're not talking about his lack of concern for people, okay? But we are talking about some other areas where Jesus just doesn't seem to show much concern, and they say, well, then you're nuts. For instance, he's unconcerned about food. We saw that in that passage we just read. It said he and his disciples were not even able to eat. And there stood Mary, a Jewish mama, pastrami sandwich in hand. You need to eat, young man. Not now. Well, he's just crazy. Doesn't have sense enough to eat what I've prepared for him. Unconcerned about food. How about this? He seems to be unconcerned about safety. I mean, before we finish this passage next week, we'll see that he's openly opposing the religious leaders. Like, for instance, had we have read the first part of this chapter, verses 1 to 6, we would see where he heals a man on the Sabbath when they're in the synagogue and those Jewish leaders are watching. Now, you would think they'd say, how wonderful that he heals a man with the withered hand. They don't say that. They say, what's he doing healing on the Sabbath? You know, we've added some rules to what God gave us, to those commandments back there. And one of his commandments was keep the Sabbath holy. And we say it's too much work to heal somebody. And you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Therefore, Jesus is violating the law. And Jesus seems to just not care. He seems to be unconcerned. And this is where the plot begins against his life. They begin not only to talk about not just silencing his voice, but his life. We got to get this guy out of the way. For one reason, he's just too popular. And we like to be the popular ones. You know, being a religious leader can easily turn to a popularity contest. Believe me. I can worry far too much about what people think in these last, I don't know, how long has it been? I should know this. Almost 50 years of preaching. And sometimes I have been too concerned about what others might think. Jesus, he's unconcerned about food. He's unconcerned about his own safety. And they will begin plotting now to take his life. Oh, he's also unconcerned about material security. Came from Nazareth, learned a trade from his father. And was recognized for that. You know, when people talked about him, they said, isn't that the carpenter from Nazareth? And did he work with wood or did he work with stone is an issue, because there wasn't a lot of wood in that area, but there's a lot of stone and limestone. And, you know, Jesus talking about being the cornerstone and all that. So we're not sure if maybe he just worked with both. But he grew up with a trade, and then he leaves home. And really, only that we know of goes back to Nazareth once, and that doesn't turn out very well. They want to kill him. That's where he says a prophet's not welcome in his own hometown. And so he's out on his own, and eventually he says this about himself: the Son of Man has no place to lay his what? His head. Yeah. I don't have a house to go back to. I just carry my pillow with me. And wherever I'm at, that's where I lay my head. Well, you're nuts. You just don't have the concerns that you should. You don't care about food or safety or material security. Or how about this one? Unconcerned about social standards. Unconcerned about social standards. Look at this. You just chose your 12. You'll see that if you look back, the choosing of the 12. You just chose your cabinet. And look at them. What a motley crew they are. And you don't seem to care about these important social standards. We saw you speaking to women in public. And they weren't even 100% Jewish women. Some of them were half-breeds. Oh, and some of them were harlots. And you spoke to them. What's the matter with you? Are you nuts? Don't you care about the standards around here? And then we saw him at some of their parties. Whose parties? The sinners' parties. We saw him there eating with them. We don't eat with anyone that's a sinner. But he does. What is he, nuts? Crazy? And that's in the text here, in the story here, and in the life of Jesus then and there. But many in history have made the same accusation about Jesus. He's crazy. Well, he's probably even suicidal. Now, it never held up, did it? Throughout all these years, thousands of years now, because had that have held up, that Jesus was out of his mind, then Christianity would have been long gone. No, there's far too much evidence against lunacy. His keen mind. You know, they come with these pre-thought out situations and stories, hypothetical usually, and lay it in front of him and say, now we've got him. And he would come up with the coolest answers, simple, short, that would send them walking away, shaking their heads. He was a marvelous debater. And how about just How about just the varied number of followers? In other words, if you look at the list of people who followed him, you see like Nicodemus among them. What was Nicodemus? He was a Pharisee. In fact, he was a big-time Pharisee because it says a ruler once came to Jesus by night, there in John 3. And Nicodemus quietly, for much of it, until finally he comes out when Jesus is killed and needs a grave. But Nicodemus is a follower. Look at the varied number of followers. Peter. I mean, sometimes we say, oh yeah, Peter, just a fisherman. But I'll tell you what he was. He was a common sense guy. He had street smarts. And he followed Jesus to his death. How about the Apostle Paul, who comes along later on? He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. That's what he's called. That's what they called him. That's what they considered him. An educated, highly educated person. He follows. He gives his life to this crazy man? No. No. How about Luke? Not a Jew, a Greek, a Gentile. How about Luke? And what did Luke do for a profession? I hear it. Yeah. Physician, doctor. He's got a doctor that follows him, that writes a book, actually two, because of his discipleship toward Jesus. In fact, I think you could say this, if you just look at all the history up till now, there are even times when his opponents will admit this. He was a great teacher. Now, if someone is crazy, is insane, you do not say, that person makes a great teacher. But they said that of him. By the way, all this talk about being accused of lunacy, as his disciples, you and I, as his disciples, we could be similarly accused. May we be similarly accused? May we not take it personally if someone says about us, nuts, crazy. Do you know what will cause them to say that? This description we've made of Jesus here about his lack of concerns, you could say it very simply: eternal over temporal. Eternal over temporal. That describes the priorities of Jesus and why people would say he's got a lack of concern about what matters. And if they could say that about us, we should be honored. Unconcerned about food. Have you ever fasted? Have you ever had one of those times in your life where you said, I must just get away from food and just spend time seeking him, seeking his face, seeking his will, and for a little while, I'm just not going to care about food. Oh, you've got to at least eat something. Well, I really don't have to. Oh, the times that we will frustrate our mothers as they hold their pastrami sandwiches and shake their heads because we didn't care about food. Because food is temporal. And we're concerned about the eternal. How about being unconcerned about our safety? There are times when Christians have sacrificed their very life, not just their safety, but their very life for the gospel. Jim Elliot grew up in my hometown, Portland, Oregon. He was born about 10 or 11 years after my dad, they both went to Benson High School in Portland. Not together at the same time, but they both attended the same high school. Jim Elliot, the man who then became the missionary to Ecuador, to the tribes that were totally unaware of the gospel, never had heard the gospel, and ended up killing him, taking his life. Of course, also, after his death, many ended up coming to Christ. You know, he's the one that we like to quote that statement that Jim Elliot made. Do you remember it? He is no fool who gives up that which he cannot gain to gain that which he cannot keep. I didn't say that right, but what he was saying was, I'm no fool for giving up my life to gain eternity. And that's all about where your concerns are. He's such an example of being unconcerned about safety. How about being unconcerned about our material security? Boy, this one speaks to us, doesn't it? Sure speaks to me. I mean, when it comes to material security as a Christian, I just feel like I've always had a long way to go. I remember when Jenny and I first got married, and we rented an apartment in Joplin, and then when we moved to San Jose, and we were there for 11 years in the ministry, and we rented first an apartment, and then a 3-bedroom home. And I remember how I was always kind of embarrassed. You know, where do you live? Oh, we live at 103 Hayes Avenue. Oh, that's a nice area. Yeah, a good place to buy. Well, the interest rate, you know, it's 14% right now, and we're renting $800 a month for renting. I remember that. I remember that I was 36 years old when we moved to Eugene and bought our first home at 8.35%, because that was a steal of a deal at the time. And the house was $51,000. Whew! I am an owner. And my payment was only in the 500s. It's great. But no sooner did I own my own home than I started thinking about, do I have any equity? And as I got older, I thought about, well, am I putting enough into an IRA to be able to retire? And this Social Security thing, we're not getting all that much. Are we going to make it? Material security. Folks, that's temporal. Your mansion in glory will not have a price tag on it because there's nothing to buy it with. Temporal versus eternal. He seemed to be unconcerned, but really he had his priorities straight. Oh, and this last one. If you're seeking first the kingdom of God and letting all those other things be added into your life, then you can finally also be unconcerned about social standards. Unconcerned about social standards like Jesus. A couple guys in the book called Same Kind of Different As Me. Ron Hall, self-made millionaire, lived in high society, Dallas, Texas. Ron Hall, an international art dealer. Second person, Denver Moore. 18 years he lived on a Louisiana plantation during the 50s and 60s as a slave. He escaped from that horrid environment and turned into a dangerous, violent, homeless vagrant who ends up in Dallas, Texas. And that's the story in that book. How would those two at opposite poles ever be drawn together? Well, Ron Hall had a wife who had come to Jesus and who began understanding this thing of eternal over temporal. And she got involved in a downtown rescue mission. I mean, really involved. And actually drew her husband into that, where Denver Moore finally came by. And there was conflicts, and they feared one another, and on it went. But if you stick with that story from beginning to end, you realize that finally, from both sides, social standards were thrown to the wind, because that's just temporal. And if we share together in the eternal, it's level. It's a level playing field. It's all equalized in Jesus. I guess you could even say sometimes there are church standards that we have to say, you know what? We're making way too big a deal out of that. That's just temporal. We're all about what's eternal. Well, there are always varied opinions about Jesus. Always. And we just looked at one of them today. He's crazy. And we realize that accusation has been made all along throughout the years and could be made about us. I read about a woman who was being interviewed for a job. And she made this statement to the interviewer. She made this statement about herself. She said to him, I never tell myself, I never tell others, I don't have time. I just say, it's not a priority. Some of us could use that line. Stop saying I don't have time, we all have the same amount of time, and just admit it. What you're saying to me, what you're so excited about, what you're trying to sell me or talk me into, sorry, it's just not a priority. It's temporal. It's temporal. I'm in Christ. I'm in Jesus. When non-Christians meet up with Christians who have those kind of priorities, eternal over temporal like Jesus did, they might call us crazy. Can you handle that? Last night I saw an Edward Jones commercial, and I loved their byline, and I have maybe heard this for years, I don't know, but it jumped at me last night in relationship to this message. Edward Jones' motto, the key to being rich is knowing what counts. Jesus knew what counted. We say we're his followers. When you take on those kinds of values, who knows what people will say about your sanity? It's okay. Because we want to be like Jesus. We want to be like him. Because he is Lord. Let's stand together and sing that song.